Hi, my name is Lindsay Visser, and I am the Development and Communications Manager at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site.
And I'm Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States.
And we are very excited today to be talking to you a little bit about our United States Constitution. So, Mr. President, could you tell me, what does Article 2 of the Constitution focus on?
Article 2 deals with the powers and responsibilities of the executive. Article 2 is the portion of the Constitution that delineates the presidency of the United States.
So in order to become President of the United States, there are certain requirements that must be fulfilled. So you have to be 35 years old, you must be a natural-born citizen, you must be a resident of the United States for 14 years, and most importantly, you must take the oath of office. But I know you had a very unique circumstance in which you took your first oath of office in 1901. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Circumstances that brought me here to Buffalo, New York. I was serving as the Vice President of the United States. And as everyone viewing now knows, upon the death of the President, the Vice President ascends to the office. President McKinley was sadly shot here in Buffalo on September 6th of 1901. I rushed to Buffalo to be by his side, as did members of the government. And after a few days, it was determined that he was likely to recuperate from his wounds. It would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if the Vice President was seen to go on a planned vacation in the beloved Adirondack Mountains. I joined Mrs. Roosevelt in the Adirondacks. I camped out at Lake Colden with all of our 6 children. I climbed Mount Marcy, the highest point in New York State, and on coming down was informed that the President was failing. I was needed in Buffalo. And so I raced down Mount Marcy in the middle of the night in a rainstorm, my drivers changing thrice, as were my horses, eventually arriving at North Creek Depot early in the morning on September 14th, 1901, and informed there by telegram from Secretary of State John Hay that President McKinley had died earlier that morning at 2:15 here in Buffalo. I came by train to Buffalo, here to the home of my friend, Mr. Ansley Wilcox. We'd been friends for many years, from the time I was in the New York General Assembly, advocating issues with which Mr. Wilcox had great sympathy, like the creation of the Niagara Falls State Park, the cause of progressive issues, civil service reform, and that sort of thing. And so it was here that I took the oath of office, downstairs in the Wilcox Mansion, now the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site. I would take the oath a second time. When I took the oath of office in Buffalo in September of 1901, I had to do so borrowing Mr. Wilcox's jacket. I had a top hat borrowed from the neighbor. In 1905, after I was elected by the largest electoral vote and popular vote plurality in our history in a contested election to that date, well, I had a proper inauguration that March of 1905, and I wore my own coat and my own hat.
Good.
And unlike the circumstance here, I took the oath of office here without the use of a Bible. I had my family Bible in 1905, opened to in my left hand upon James 1:22. Be thou not only hearers of the word, but doers of the word also.
That's magnificent. So you said you took your oath of office in the library of the Wilcox home. How many people do you think were able to witness your first inauguration?
Not as many as would have liked to.
Right.
I kicked the newspaper photographers out of the library after some conundrum, some disturbance of equipment toppling over itself. So there weren't but a handful of observers in my memory. You might know better. Might the number have been a dozen or so in attendance?
I think it was approximately 50, but it was still quite a small gathering compared to a normal inauguration, especially as you know from your 1905 inauguration, that was quite the crowd assembled in the Capitol, right?
Thousands attend.
Oh, goodness.
But I don't know if we should be asking the person who took the inauguration anymore how many people attended the inauguration.
That's a very fair point. So, Mr. President, after you take your oath of office, what are the duties of the President of the United States?
The duties are enormous and have become even more so since our founding. The President is charged with command of the Army and the Navy. Of course, now that extends to all of the armed forces, including the Air Force, which I don't think the constitutional fathers could have presaged. The president is also given the power of granting pardons, that is, giving forgiveness for crimes for which people have been convicted on the federal level. I cannot pardon for criminal activity at the state level, but I can pardon federal crimes. The president has the power to make treaties, and this, however, is subject to the ratification of the Senate, something we may discuss a bit later in our conversation. The president has the power to nominate ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls. Perhaps most importantly, justices and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, one of our equal branches of government, and to appoint other offices not specified in the Constitution but provided for by federal statute.
So now you mentioned that some of these powers are subject to the consent of Congress. What is the relationship between the executive branch and the other branches of government?
Those powers subject to the consent or approval or the cooperative relationship with Congress, sometimes in opposition to Congress, and also that third branch of government, a very important relationship with the United States Supreme Court and the judiciary. Our founders, I think, were quite insightful to make a system of checks and balances. These would have been, for example, that I could sign legislation approved by Congress. That's a cooperative relationship. Or I could veto legislation passed by the Congress. Now, in this case, the laws of the Congress would be passed by a simple majority of the members of the House and the members of the Senate. After I vetoed a piece of legislation, the chambers, the Congress, could either accept my veto or attempt to override my veto, in which case an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the members of each of those chambers must vote in the affirmative to override the president's veto. There are also other powers, checks and balances by Congress. For example, in the delegated powers or the enumerated powers of Congress, those include, for the House of Representatives, the fact that they shall be the house of origin for all bills for spending, for the coinage of monies and that sort of thing. Also that in the Congress resides the power to declare war, subject hence to court cases actually on something called the War Powers Act, a place where Congress and the presidency have from time to time debated about balancing this ability and authority to declare war and the president's inherent constitutional authority to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. There's also, ultimately, with the Congress, the power of impeachment, that the House of Representatives can vote articles of impeachment, and then the impeachment process, the Senate serving as the jury in the impeachment process. And you and our viewers know the history. Presidents have been impeached twice. President Andrew Johnson, the successor to President Lincoln, impeached by the House and missing conviction by the Senate by mere one vote. And in more recent years, President William Jefferson Clinton being impeached by the House of Representatives, and the vote for impeachment falling far short in that case of a majority vote for impeachment. To go on back to the Supreme Court in that case, the President has the power to appoint the Associate Justices and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, subject to confirmation by Congress, by the United States Senate. I appointed 3 members to the United States Supreme Court, Justice William Day of Ohio, William Henry Moody of Massachusetts, and also from that latter state, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a very famous member of the Supreme Court. In the latter case, Justice Holmes did not vote in the affirmative to sustain the government's case in the Northern Securities Antitrust case. He voted and wrote the opinion for the dissent, at which time I said I could carve a better justice out of a banana. But eventually our relationship was salvaged, and of course Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Left his stamp on the Supreme Court equal to Brandeis or Berger or any of the other very important jurists that we've had on that court.
Definitely. I think he was also one of the longest serving Supreme Court justices in our history. So especially with the office of the presidency, with so much power, do you think that the framers of the Constitution had to be very careful when they designed the office of the presidency?
Careful and purposeful. We'd come off of the experience of the monarchy, an executive run amok. So certainly part of the original intent of the framers was to restrain the office of executive through this system of checks and balances. And to back up just a bit, of course, even the election of the president to be done by the Electoral College, not directly by the citizens themselves. Checks and balances proceeding even on through the Constitution of Congress itself, that the members of the House could be elected by the people, but that the members of the Senate would be elected indirectly by the state legislatures thereof. And this is one of the places where I hope to empower the government to do more on behalf of the people by being an advocate for the direct election of members of the United States Senate, something achieved shortly after my own demise. It was also true, though, that I experienced a constitution and constitutional interpretation that restrained the power of the chief executive. I have a presidency that is regarded as having expanded the authority of the chief executive through some things like simply using executive orders in places they had not previously been used. For example, I named Pelican Island the first federal bird sanctuary off the coast of Florida. Beforehand, I asked my Attorney General, Philander Knox, was there anything in the Constitution or the statutes of the United States which would expressly prohibit me from naming Pelican Island a federal bird sanctuary? Attorney General Knox hemmed and hawed and said there's no express prohibition. I said I thus declare it. The first of 51 now national wildlife refuges recognized as being initiated under my administration. I did not like interpreting the Constitution as a straitjacket in which I must bind myself. I instead thought that if actions were not expressly prohibited to the executive by the Constitution, then I might try to use the authority to do the good that I sought to do. For example, the Panama Canal. Some of my opponents in Congress said I had no constitutional authority whatsoever to enter into this particular treaty or series of treaties with the breakaway Republic of Panama. Certainly no constitutional authority to take some of the actions taken by my administration previous and during the Panamanian Revolution. For example, Congress also said I had no constitutional authority to leave the United States during my term of office in 1906 when I went to go visit Panama to see the Panama Canal. I had to assure members of Congress that I would remain in shipboard-to-shipboard contact via radio with the office of the President in the White House, and therefore there would be no vacancy in the White House. So we have a Constitution that restrains the power of the President. The powers of Congress are enumerated, and the powers of the presidency are enumerated. In certain cases, however, Congress has delegated some of its power to the presidency. For example, the Forest Reserve Act, which empowers the president to name national forests from amongst the public lands. And during my presidency, the Monuments and Antiquities Act, which delegated from Congress to President the authority to name certain public lands of scientific, historic, or prehistoric interest as national monuments. Congress, I believe, thinking that I would be limiting my consideration to certain finite locations like Devil's Tower in Wyoming, Montezuma's Castle in the Petrified Forest in Arizona, Jewel Cave in South Dakota. But in 1908, I used those powers to sign an executive order to name the entire Grand Canyon a national monument. At which point, Speaker of the House Joe Cannon said of me, President Roosevelt has as much use for the Constitution as a tomcat has for a marriage license. I said the Constitution's made for the people, not the people for the Constitution.
That's a very profound sentiment. And I think one of the things that you've hit upon, especially talking about your presidency, is one of the most remarkable qualities of our Constitution, and that's the ability to adapt to the times, and the fact that we have the ability to interpret it and amend it and to make the changes necessary to continue to rely upon the Constitution and to help us govern ourselves. So can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that?
The process of amending the Constitution to meet the needs of our times, it's most evident now as we come upon and celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage.
Yes.
There are many states, for example, Wyoming, the equality state they call themselves, for even from territorial times. In Wyoming, women had the right to vote, but it didn't come to the people of the country, guaranteed through the Constitution, until the election of 1920. I am happy to say that in 1912, when I was the Progressive Party candidate, the Progressive Party advocated women's suffrage. In 1918, the state of New York voted women's suffrage. I wasn't around to see the election of 1920, but I think we're a better country for the fact that women have the right and exercise the vote. This process of amendment is not an easy one. It's not to be taken lightly. So the requirement that a certain number of states and state legislatures and the Congress must endorse and ratify the constitutional amendments, it's another set of checks and balances to make sure that our Constitution doesn't become a greater encumbrance for being a document too much burdened by the whims of the day, but that amendments are undertaken with very deliberate consideration.
Wow.
Well, this has been fascinating. Mr. President, do you have anything else to add?
I do. My favorite president was Abraham Lincoln. An inspiration to me. I never made a major decision without thinking, what would Abraham Lincoln do? He told the people of this country at Gettysburg, reminded us in 1863 that ours was a government of, by, and for the people. We've discussed the United States Constitution. Some say that the Declaration of Independence is our birth certificate and that the Constitution is our owner's manual. It's something that reminds us that ours is a democratic republic, that the authority of our branches of government rests upon the people, the permission of the people as expressed through elections. And so I'm asking each and every one of you that's watching this brief video today to exercise your duties as citizen. Some of you will soon be 18 years old, the age of majority, the age for serving in the United States military, the age for voting. I would hope that the duties of citizenship, those duties that are inherent in our owner's manual, that you'll take up those duties, your fair share, and do what you can to make sure that this great republic, based on its Constitution, perpetuates itself into future generations, and that we can indeed be a great country for the fact that we are a good people.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. President. It has been a pleasure having you here today.
The pleasure was
And
mine.
It's wonderful to talk a little bit about the Constitution with such an authority on the topic.
Bully!
Well, thank you all so much for watching. Check back and we'll see if we have other videos.